Chapter 22, Global Involvements in World War I, 1902 to 1920. Well before 1917, events abroad gripped the attention of Washington, the media, and ordinary Americans. From this perspective, World War I was one episode in a larger process of deepening U.S. global involvement. By 1900, America had become an industrial powerhouse seeking foreign markets and raw materials, and these widening economic interests brought a new level of international engagement. This expanded world role, with important home front ramifications, has continued to shape American history to the present. These broader involvements around the world, culminating in World War I, are the focus of this chapter. It was April 6, 1917, and Jane Addams was troubled. By overwhelming margins, Congress had just declared war on Germany. Deeply patriotic, Addams also believed in peace and deplored her nation's decision for war. As the founder of Hull House, a Chicago settlement house, Addams had worked to overcome tensions among different ethnic groups. In Newer Ideals of Peace, published in 1907, she had insisted that the multi-ethnic internationalism of America's immigrant neighborhoods proved that national and ethnic hostilities could be overcome. Addams had also observed how war spirit could inflame a people. During the Spanish-American War, she had watched Chicago children play at killing Spaniards. When Europe went to war in 1914, Addams worked to end the conflict. A founder of the Women's Peace Party in 1915, she attended an International Congress of Women that urged the warring nations to submit their differences to arbitration. Addams met with President Wilson in a futile effort to enlist his support for arbitration. When America entered the war, Addams had to take a stand. Deepening her dilemma, many of her friends, including John Dewey, were lining up behind Wilson. Theodore Roosevelt, whose 1912 presidential campaign Addams had enthusiastically supported, was beating the drums for war. Addams' experience underscores how deeply World War I affected America. Whether they donned uniforms, worked on farms or in factories, or simply experienced U.S. life in wartime, the war touched all Americans. Beyond its immediate effects, the war had long-lasting social, economic, and political ramifications. As the 20th century opened, the United States was determined to establish its presence on the world scene. In Spanish America, efforts by the United States to acquire a canal route between the oceans seemed stalled when the Colombian Senate rejected a proposed treaty for passage through the Colombian province of Panama. With a U.S. warship offshore, Panama proclaimed its independence, and within a short time the new nation of Panama made a treaty with the United States, allowing the Panama Canal to be built. Theodore Roosevelt justified this action, asserting the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, arguing for continued American strength in the region. To further American economic interests, William Howard Taft would institute dollar diplomacy investing in Latin America. Wilson, instituting what he called missionary diplomacy, sent Marines into Haiti and Dominican Republic. U.S. actions on the world scene, especially the one in China, reflected a search for world order on U.S. terms, an international system founded on a unique blend of liberalism, democracy, and capitalistic enterprise. Events in Mexico triggered Wilson's most serious crisis in Latin America. Mexico had won independence from Spain in 1820, but the nation remained divided between a landowning elite and an impoverished peasantry. In 1911, rebels led by the democratic reformer Francisco Madero had ended the 30-year rule of President Diaz, a defender of the wealthy elite. Early in 1913, just as Wilson took office, Mexican troops loyal to General Huerta overthrew and murdered Madero. Wilson's response focused on protecting the 40,000 U.S. citizens who had settled in Mexico under Diaz's regime and safeguarding the U.S. investors who had poured some $2 billion into Mexican oil wells and other ventures. Reversing the long-standing U.S. practice of recognizing all governments, Wilson refused to recognize Huerta's government of butchers. Announced Wilson, "I am going to teach the South American republics to elect good men." In 1914, 7,000 U.S. troops occupied Veracruz and battled Huerta's forces. 65 Americans and approximately 500 Mexicans were killed or wounded. Bowing to U.S. might, Huerta abdicated. Carranza took power, and the troops withdrew. This 1913 cartoon from a London humor magazine captured Wilson's moralistic tone toward other nations and the resentments it aroused. When war began in Europe in 1914, most Americans initially wanted to remain neutral in thought as well as in action. The nation had, however, cultural ties with England, and many Americans of English or German or Irish ancestry felt an emotional tug toward one side or the other. The most difficult part of maintaining neutrality was to preserve U.S. neutral rights at sea. German submarine warfare was a source of real danger. Hoping for peace, the United States began preparation for war. Wilson recognized that the American worldview would not fare well in a world dominated by Germany, nor would it fare well without U.S. participation in any post-war settlement. The sinking of British and French passenger ships, especially the Lusitania, carrying American citizens, provoked strong public reaction, and Germany pledged not to attack merchant vessels without warning. Diminishing trade with the Central Powers and extensive loans and booming trade with the Allies inclined the United States further toward support of the Allies. With the war at a stalemate on the Western Front, German leaders decided to resume unrestricted submarine warfare. They reasoned that the United States would not be able to place its troops at the front soon enough to prevent a German victory. The United States soon declared war, especially after an antagonistic note was intercepted from the German ambassador Zimmermann to Mexico, which promised a return of U.S. territory to Mexico if they would ally themselves with Germany in the war effort. The Lusitania, coupled with the Zimmermann telegram, proved to be unacceptable to the United States and justification for war declaration. This is an image of the sinking of the Lusitania, May 7th, 1915, off the Irish coast. The destruction of the Lusitania by a German U-boat, portrayed here in an illustration from an English newspaper, took nearly 1,200 lives, including 128 Americans. This event outraged U.S. public opinion and led to a buildup in military preparedness. But as President Wilson pursued diplomatic exchanges with Germany, nearly 2 more years would pass before the United States entered the war in 1917. World War I was a turning point for the United States. Millions of men were drafted and had their first experiences away from home. About 2 million U.S. soldiers went to France, and many had taken an active part in the war by late spring of 1918. Women also served in the armed forces, and many on the home front moved into jobs formerly held by men, jobs that they had to give up at the war's end. Government became involved to an unprecedented degree in civilian life through the War Industries Board and other newly created boards and agencies. Industrial cooperation was encouraged, a trend that outlasted the war years. The first U.S. troops, designated as the Allied Expeditionary Force, reached France in October 1917. Eventually, about 2 million American soldiers served in France under General John J. Pershing. This image, whipping up war enthusiasm in the heartland, is from Denver, Colorado, in which automobiles carrying young Army recruits parade through the city. In reality, there were a significant number of Americans who opposed U.S. entry into the war. African American soldiers were also called on to fight. This is a recruitment poster targeting African Americans. In this poster, Abraham Lincoln looks down approvingly as black soldiers battle the German foe. Despite what this image shows, most black troops were restricted to non-combat roles. This map shows the United States on the Western Front in 1918. American troops first saw action in the campaign to throw back Germany's spring 1918 offensive. The next heavy American engagement that autumn would eventually lead to the end of the war. This is an image of the fog of war. U.S. troops are on the Western Front, June 26, 1918. The reality of combat differed from the idealized images offered in home front propaganda. As the war's final stage began, these American soldiers attacked entrenched German positions in Alsace, a disputed region along the French-German border near Switzerland. Here they are firing a 37mm machine gun, a weapon of deadly accuracy with a maximum range of 1.5 miles. While patriotism was whipped up by the likes of the Committee on Public Information, and public support came in the form of higher taxes, liberty loans, and patriotic statements from leaders in all walks of life, intolerance of dissent from the war effort grew. The women's movement split over the issue. Many Americans suspected merely of lacking enthusiasm, sometimes suffered physical abuse. Germans, pacifists, and anti-war socialists suffered greatly at the hands of local vigilante groups. New laws against sedition sent the socialist Eugene Debs to jail as the wartime mood of idealism and resolve degenerated into insistence on conformity. Here's a World War I propaganda poster called Save Your Child. It appealed to basic emotions, urging support of the war as a way to protect home and family. This cartoon, A German in America, an American in No Man's Land, was published in March 1918 in the New York Herald. It attacked Karl Muck, the German conductor of the Boston Symphony Orchestra. Muck was arrested soon after his performance in New York and imprisoned for the rest of the war. Propaganda like this helped whip up anti-German hysteria on the home front. This poster shows Milwaukee socialist leader Victor Berger opposing war profiteers and the suppression of free speech. Elected to Congress in 1918, Berger was denied a seat because of his conviction under the Wartime Espionage Act. The Supreme Court reversed the conviction in 1921, and Berger served in Congress from 1923 to 1929. Despite the millions of personnel in the armed services, the civilian workforce grew. Wages rose and union membership increased. Women had opportunities for better jobs, and African Americans migrated north in unprecedented numbers in response to economic opportunity. This was called the Great Migration. This period also saw the meteoric rise of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, of the NAACP, as it grew from a small organization of less than 10,000 members to a vast network of more than 100,000. Although the war had stifled the reform energies of the progressive period, some reform efforts such as women's suffrage and improvement of industrial labor conditions saw real gains. In addition, the war heightened African American expectations of full equality at home. Along with the war's other effects, the nation in 1918 reeled under an outbreak of influenza, a highly contagious viral infection. The influenza pandemic, spread by a particularly deadly strain of the virus, killed approximately 50 to 100 million people worldwide. Despite public health advances, medical science had few weapons against influenza in 1918. The war would also further bolster the argument for prohibition, pointing out the German origins of large breweries such as Pabst, Schlitz, and Anheuser-Busch. Prohibitionists hinted that beer was a German plot to undermine American fitness. The 18th Amendment, establishing national prohibition, which passed Congress in December 1917, was widely seen as a war measure. Ratified in 1919, it went into effect on January 1st, 1920. This is an African American family arriving in Chicago in 1912. Seeking a better life, African Americans moved north in great numbers in the early 20th century. This chart shows the U.S. death rate from influenza and pneumonia 1900 to 1960. You can see the devastating toll of the 1918 influenza epidemic, shown by this spike here in the graph. Here's an image battling influenza 1918 Red Cross workers like these in Philadelphia and other public health professionals mobilized to combat a deadly epidemic that claimed more than 500,000 American lives. In 1918, President Wilson summed up the war aims of the United States in his 14 points. The Allies accepted them as a basis for negotiations at the Versailles Peace Conference. Despite that acceptance, the Allies effectively ignored Wilson's vision of a liberal peace and imposed a harshly punitive treaty on Germany. Wilson was dismayed. He concentrated his efforts on his one great achievement in the proposed treaty, the Covenant of the League of Nations. He was not, however, successful in convincing the U.S. Republican Senate to accept the League or the treaty. Wilson handled the situation ineptly, and even his speaking tour to carry his message to the American people turned out badly when he suffered a devastating stroke. Wilson's efforts failed, and the United States did not join the League. The aftermath of the war also brought new racial violence and anti-radical hysteria. The Red Scare, which led to mass arrests and deportations of suspected subversive elements. The trials and tribulations of the war years caused the nation to turn away from the Democrats in the election in 1920. The new president was Republican Warren G. Harding, who promised the country a return to normalcy. Seated left to right, Vittorio Orlando from Italy, David Lloyd George from Great Britain, Georges Clemenceau from France, and Woodrow Wilson from the United States. The peace conference revealed deep divisions among the Allies, as Wilson promoted his visionary New World Order, including a League of Nations, and the European powers pursued their own interests and imposed harsh terms on defeated Germany. This is The Leaders in Paris, December 1918. In this newspaper cartoon, published during the Senate battle over U.S. membership in the League of Nations, 3 Republican opponents of the League, William Borah of Idaho, Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts, and Hiram Johnson of California, stubbornly refused to give a seat to an angelic female passenger symbolizing peace. Table 22-1 shows the results of the election of 1920, where Warren G. Harding wins a decisive election. You can also see the candidates include Eugene V. Debs, who had been arrested during the war under the Sedition Act. By conservative estimates, World War I cost 10 million dead. Included in this toll were 112,000 American soldiers, 49,000 in battle, and 63,000 from disease, mostly influenza. The toll of dead and injured reflected new technologies of warfare, from U-boat torpedoes and primitive aerial bombs to tanks, poison gas, and deadlier machine guns. The Allies won, but Wilson's visionary hopes, including American membership in the new League of Nations, went unrealized. The war had far-reaching social, political, and economic effects. It advanced some reforms, notably women's suffrage and the campaigns against prostitution and alcohol. As war measures, the government expanded its regulatory power over corporations and took steps to ensure workers' well-being and right to organize. These initiatives offered models that would prove influential in the future. But in a larger sense, the war undermined progressivism's openness to new ideas, its larger commitment to social justice, and its humanitarian concern for society's most vulnerable members. As government propaganda encouraged ideological conformity and fear of radicalism, the reform impulse withered. The reactionary climate intensified in the post-war era. Internationally, despite the wrangles that kept America out of the League of Nations, the conflict underscored America's new status as a world power and left the nation's businesses and financial institutions poised for global expansion.